going to talk about like one of the things I've been working on for a while and reframing, working again on it, and I think this is the first time I'm going to present it in its current shape. It is essentially a theoretical framework with a theme attempt at empirical support, and that's what I want also to get some feedback on is like what you think you would like to have some, let's say, empirical evidence kind of makes sense to the theoretical framework, but it is essentially a theoretical. And it is about these two things I work on, which are bureaucratic politics, so how politicians control or deal with the bureaucracy, and environmental decentralization, which is basically rescaling decision-making power to lower units. Talk about these 5 things. I will start with the context and motivation while we talk about environmental decentralization. Perhaps when we talk about environmental issues, climate change, these kind of like headlines, we talk about national level policies or commitments. We talk about the climate change, the national determining commitments. We talk about the Paris Agreement. These are essentially talking about climate mitigation and at the national. But the environmental domain is quite diverse, and many dimensions of the environmental quality depend on local level provision. So things like clean water, sustainable forests, they're essentially local goods, so they happen on the ground. It is not only global, a global problem like climate change. All these connected, and the implementation, management, and monitoring of national level policies often happens or depends on the local level. So there are these dimensions. Like almost every country has decentralized to some degree the environmental commitments and the environmental policies. We care about this. Or even local governments are the ones in charge of providing some of these goods. One key issue as well with this is that all we want lower units to provide goods, to regulate and monitor. Many of the natural resources actually cross-jurisdictional, so there are problems with the spillovers. We all also care about how governments on the same level, like horizontally coordinate and work together to try to avoid problems of the spillovers across different natural resources. So even if objectives are national or even international, we depend on the local, what happens in the local level context. And particularly local decentralization has been promoted alongside decentralization reforms in general, because we have some promises about like it being good, essentially. So we like decentralization, or the theory says decentralization is good because it deepens democratic accountability. You're closer to the people who can actually basically vote against you if you don't fulfill your environmental commitments. It might reduce corruption because it is more difficult to engage with different levels if authority is disparate. That is one of the elements I'm going to talk about a bit more in a second. So there's increased access to local information, so you know what's better for the people and what the people need if your decision making happens at a local level. It is easier for experimentation because you don't need to wait until the national level decides what to do. You can actually implement things on the ground. So there are many reasons why environmental centralization has been argued to be used. So if policy is going to be more efficient, it's going to be more fair, it's going to be better, and ideally that's going to lead to better environmental. So that's the promise. The evidence is quite mixed. Not only for many other dimensions of digitalization, which I think like in some areas, I think perhaps for education or public health, there's more the promise has been fulfilled to a great extent for the environmental domain, not that much. Actually, what we see is that there's a level of local underinvestment, so politicians prefer to prioritize other goods that perhaps are more electorally salient, and externalities. So if I can move pollution to the border, so I don't need to deal with it, I will do it. So sometimes centralization actually works against the environmental outcomes we want to achieve. And this is one of the key problems in the evidence. Sometimes it works. It seems sometimes actually for some of the goods, if you decentralize, so you might have better outcomes. Where the evidence stands is difficult is quite heterogeneous. Essentially because decentralization poses coordination challenges. This is like some of the this is a big summary, let's say, of the decentralization literature about what's bad and what's good. And one of the difficulties of decentralization is that you have first vertical coordination challenges. So you need to, with central government, regional governments, and local governments to work together. This creates problems. If you Then local governments can exploit the informational advantage for the benefits of specific groups, not necessarily for the people as for the general public as we would expect. It is easier to capture local governments than national level governments. That's also one of the arguments, problems of vertical coordination. And there's more oversight in it. So you don't have a big state that will be able to put everyone together in agreement. And also there's a problem I already hinted at in terms of horizontal coordination. So you need local governments to coordinate among each other to provide or to protect goods like watersheds, where you have actually one river that cuts across different jurisdictions. The municipalities that are downstream are going to be usually affected by whatever happens upstream, so you need to coordinate across jurisdictions. This is difficult because that may actually lead to race to the bottom behavior, where municipalities are actually trying to compete for mobile capital, so reducing the environmental stringency, trying to capture voters, essentially trying to capture taxpayers. So the big question in decentralization, particularly in this case for the environment, is what are the conditions under which decentralization is going to work? So this is the answer we have so far, is like there are different moderators that will help solve the coordination issues and then make decentralization deliver the promise. Some of those answers, like I summarize here, is part decentralization. A bit of the political economy literature says if you have a very strong party, national party, that can actually align local governments and local politicians' incentives towards like a nationally coordinated strategy, so it might be easier for decentralization to work. If you have, of course, a strong central government that can actually monitor and coordinate and enforce the regulation. This is another important point more on the democratic side, is that you have a strong civil society that can actually demand from local governments the improvement of environmental conditions, that might actually help as well solve the coordination issues. And there are other, like more, let's say, institutional questions, these institutional proposals on how to make decentralization work around fiscal equalization or the design of different grants. There's a bunch of literature. Of course, like where I come in is saying that it is not enough, like there are other things that have been not considered yet. Like this is one of the things I'm saying, like this is my main argument. This is one thing that has not been considered so far, or not seriously, and that's what I want to do. So one of the points with most of the answers to the coordination challenges of decentralization is that they kind of assume that the state exists and it kind of works. It's there and it's kind of neutral, or it always works towards the interests of politicians just immediately as politicians demand. And that's not necessarily the case. I think the story is a bit more complicated. And usually, particularly regarding global south context, everyone just talks about capacity as a very general abstract concept, usually referring to like fiscal resources, so money on the ground, or corruption. So everyone is corrupt and everyone's going to act in favor of their party interest. I think the story is a bit more complicated, and this is the one institutional and political condition I propose, is the politicization of the bureaucracy. Let me tell you this small story. You might say, okay, this is important for global south context, where bureaucracies are basically spoiled systems for the politicians. Well, just small story from the US, the Environmental Protection Agency, the main US environmental regulator. Last year, employees from this agency put out a letter saying that the new director was basically working against the principles of the agency, was trying to dismiss the original intention of the objectives of the agency. The week after, the administration puts on administrative leave like 100 or something of these employees who were signing the petition. And they started moving, like relocating these employees to other offices that are easier to control. So like the way politicians can use and move around with the bureaucracy masses, even in cases like in the US, that's a relatively professionalized bureaucracy. Of course, let me talk about another case, that's Brazil. Relatively professionalized for global south countries into the bureaucracy, but during Bolsonaro times, there was a lot of pressure for the management of the Amazon, as you might imagine. One of his responses to this was creating a new agency that kind of existed before but was inactive. He reacted the agency, and the main committee, which was essentially the agency, were 12 members of the military basically appointed by Bolsonaro. Like you can imagine how that works. And none of the actual environmental regulators were part of that agency. So the management of the Amazon was in the hands of the military, who were basically controlled by Bolsonaro. So my argument here is the politics of the bureaucracy matters for how policy is living. Particularly in the environment, these two very simple cases, and you've seen the results of the grand scheme of how Bolsonaro or Trump have changed environmental policy. And there's a lot of literature on bureaucratic politics, and particularly now like re-emerging the topic of patronage, which is politicians hiring and firing public personnel, and it affects policy. So there's a couple of, let's say, spliced parts of patronage for the politics of the bureaucracy. One is the so-called loyalty competence trade-off. So politicians might prefer to appoint loyal personnel over expertise, essentially. So trying to control, increase the control over the bureaucracy. We will also know that more meritocratic recruitment improves regulatory quality. So regulation might be improved by more meritocratic experts in the recruitment in the bureaucracy. And that's because of these reasons, how politicians might use the bureaucracy. So the actual implementation machinery of the state is going to favor politicians' preferences. So this is kind of a moderation between how much a politician would prefer to his will or her will on the environment, and how much the bureaucracy might stop, prevents, or facilitates that. And I think the picture also can be nuanced. And there's some evidence that's recent, but actually this is an argument that starts around the 40s and 50s, studying the modernization in the US and Brazil of the state, and is that sometimes actually patronage or the control of the bureaucracy can actually help, because that might help move resources towards places that will be disconnected otherwise. So these networks of politicians, if they want to deliver, they can actually leverage the power of the bureaucracy to gain access to resources. They can reduce the coordination, the principal agent problem between the bureaucracy and the implementation and the decision making, if they want to, as it were, like if they have the incentives to deliver. And there's some recent evidence from China, from Brazil, showing that actually sometimes patronage might improve the delivery of certain goods. So trying to connect back the decentralization part to the patronage bureaucratic politics literature, one of the key elements of the decentralization is that, yes, it decentralizes decision-making policy and decision-making power of the environmental policy, but it also decentralizes control of the bureaucracy. Like through decentralization, local bureaucrats change principles or extend the number of principles they need to obey to, some sort of mix between party networks, central ministries, local politicians, and state constituents. So there's a problem of multiplying the number of principles they obey to, and that also makes the incentives and the way they can implement or enact policies. So the same reforms that reshape policy authority, they reshape the control of the bureaucracy. I think there might be different ways in which this might play out for decentralization to work. And this is what I try to do. This is the actual thing, like what I call a theoretical framework, to try to understand how these two things work together, how the politicization of the bureaucracy might enable or condition the willingness and the capacity of governments to work together, to resolve coordination issues, or like might actually increase the coordination issues. So this is going to be a packed slide. Buckle up. I'll go. So the assumption is that decentralization happens in a state structure, and that state structure is going to be politicized to a certain degree. And I'm taking what I've learned and what we know about patronage and about the politicization of the bureaucracy to understand what are the potential channels or mechanisms through which politicization might affect the ability of these states to implement the decentralization. I have 4 channels. First one, capacity erosion. This is related to the loyalty competence trade-off. Basically, you reduce expertise in the bureaucracy. It makes it more difficult to first implement and adapt national level policy at the local level. It might be more difficult also to coordinate across different governments because let's say the common technical expertise is missing. So it's more difficult to achieve common solutions to try to propose policies that are aligned across governments. So first, capacity erosion might reduce this coordination dynamic, so might make it more difficult. Two, political capture. This is essentially one of the key arguments in the environmental politics literature, is that decentralization increases the ability of local elites to capture natural rains and natural local regulation. Well, the politics of the bureaucracy that's here, like politicization of the bureaucracy that's here, works as a moderator of the relationship, like a more technocratic, more meritocratic bureaucracy, very more difficult to control. So if you think about local enforcement officers, if an enforcement officer is basically just a client of the incumbent, it might be easier to avoid enforcement on the ground. So this is one of the key problems. If it is a neutral, meritocratic employee, it might be more difficult to control. That's more or less the point here. It is having the ability of local capture, or the likelihood of local capture. A third point is intertemporal stability, and this is related to, let's say, the credible commitment issues of that patronage creates, in the sense that patronage of political appointments increase the intertemporal instability of the bureaucracy. After a new government, a new bunch of people arrive, and the people that were with the previous incumbent just go away. So it's more difficult to be able to commit to different policy proposals or consistent across time, because organizational churn is basically going to erode that commitment. It's more difficult to, if you need to consider for the environment where long-term horizons are very important for many objectives, so the instability created by patronage is going to make it more difficult to coordinate across time. And finally, this is a bit of the, let's say, controversial part of the theoretical framework, is that political capital that comes with patronage networks might sometimes actually facilitate coordination. So this is related to a previous point I mentioned about favoring states development at the local level, what happened in Brazil, particularly during the 60s. Also case from Colombia, that's particularly what I work on, is patronage networks help some regions actually develop more quickly, thanks to being connected to the center. So sometimes, if there are incentives, actually these connections might reduce the distance between different governments or different levels of the government, and might facilitate the coordination of policy. It might be, of course, negative as well, because it facilitates as well, like capture across levels. So if everyone is captured by the same political group, so it might be easier to also capture natural rains or try to erode monitoring. So this is a bit of a mixed prediction here, just to say that sometimes political capital facilitated by patronage networks may actually be. Now, this is a surprising, somewhat surprising, at least, piece of evidence we have. So these are the 4 channels I propose. But these channels, so how these channels play out together or work, or if they are activated or easier to activate, let's say, depend on at least 2, I think there might be more, this is what I have so far, to political, broader political scope conditions. The first one is the political integration of veto points. So I mentioned decentralization fragments power across the territory and across levels. That makes it more difficult to establish capture at all levels, because you have more principles, more different interests, potentially different political allegiances, which on the one side might prevent patronage networks from working well, as it were, like well in the sense that they will capture the state apparatus. So if authority is fragmented, decision-making is fragmented, if you have more veto points, it is more difficult to coordinate either for delivering goods, like the actual benefits we want, or for capturing natural rains, capturing the regulation. So these might work in both directions. So the problem here is how fragmented are the veto points and how politically integrated they are. So these are 2 things happening here. So if you have many veto points, it's more difficult to coordinate. But if you have some sort of political power that centralizes that fragmentation, say political parties, very strong political parties, as I mentioned before, so the veto points are not going to be that difficult to manage. They might be more easily aligned. So fragmentation makes coordination more difficult in general, and that's true both for delivering the actual goods or in activating these political networks for providing goods that we want, or for capturing regulation. And the second point is related to the one of the points I also mentioned earlier. It's about downward accountability. So how much politicians need to respond to local constituents, local voters. That might be related to how competitive local elections are, or how much you have a civil society that's engaged and demanding and willing to punish incumbents. Those are, let's say, these broader political scope conditions that will mix how the different channels are activated or they're easier to use. And finally, this is not the same for all environmental goods. I talked so far about environmental goods in a very general way, but they are very different across the spectrum. And what matters particularly here for this theory, what I proposed, is what I call the political attributability gradient. So how easy it is for claim credits and offer local benefits for politicians across different environmental goods. And that might be for local environmental goods like drinking water, green urban areas, sanitation. This is highly attributable. It's very easy to say, I am the incumbent, I'm the mayor of the city, this is what I'm doing. And it's very electorally salient. So it might be easier to, for instance, here, activate this downward accountability. So if there's strong accountability, this is more likely to be showing at for local environmental goods. And even if you have a strong political capital and strong political networks, under conditions of downward accountability, with strong downward accountability, for local environmental goods, you might see that patronage or more politicization might be causing improvements in local environmental goods. And this is kind of like one of the potential hypotheses that would emerge from this framework. So with ecosystems management or natural resources that are more related to common pool resources that cut across different jurisdictions, where you have more, where it's more difficult to achieve agreement because the credit claiming is more difficult, because long-term horizons also make it more difficult to commit. So it is not as attributable. Things like biodiversity, forests, watersheds. So in these cases, it is more likely that the negative channels at patronage are going to produce negative effects on the environment. And finally, of course, for global environmental goods, particularly climate change mitigation, where essentially there's no way to claim credit locally, or where very long time horizons are at play, is more difficult to actually, for the patronage mechanisms to provide goods. So in this case, patronage is likely to produce worse resources, or to increase the coordination demands and the coordination challenges of decentralization. So it's very difficult to trace each one of the potential channels happening and how they play out in each of the scope conditions. This would be able to provide at least a very long list of propositions and hypotheses. This is what I had so far, and what I want to offer is some empirical evidence, even if it's just intuitive, that this makes sense. And let's say the signature of the framework is what you would observe across these three different types of environmental goods. So what I say basically is that the interaction between patronage or bureaucratic politicization and decentralization is going to be less negative, as it were, potentially even beneficial in the case of local environmental goods, and the more diffuse the benefits and the longer the time horizons of the provision, so the more negative the interaction is going to be. This is essentially the big proposition of the theoretical framework. What I do is I have a panel of about 100 countries, a bit more, from 2000 to 2020. I have a bunch of indicators from the Environmental Performance Index, this project at Yale University. They gather many different environmental indicators, from carbon emissions to drinking water at the local level. So what I'm trying to use is leverage that I have. I can kind of see this gradient of political attributability across the different goods, the different environmental indicators. And what I'm looking at is fiscal decentralization as expenditure at the local level as a share of the national level, Political decentralization, I'm looking at the independence and like if local agencies, local and regional governments are elected and independent from the national level. I also have a new measure of policy decentralization that is specific for the environment. These two are more general. This is like fiscal decentralization and political decentralization. Policy decentralization is specifically about environment, and I have this big data set of policy instruments around the world. What I'm trying to see is this data set distinguishes between the levels of government that implements the policy. So what I'm trying to say is the proportion of policies in a country that are actually adopted at the local level. So trying to say there's political independence, but is that political autonomy? Is that political autonomy actually related to more policy, environmental policy, specifically at the local level? And I'm basically aggregating these three indicators into a big decentralization measure. Because my sample size is not huge, I want to try to have a very simple empirical setting. Also because I'm looking at these at a very general level. These are our national aggregates, essentially. So it's very difficult to say whatever the central government, the local governments do, it's going to reflect at the national level. I'm trying to argue here that this is some sort of national general equilibrium of all the things that happen within the country. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what the outcome is going to be reflecting. I have a bunch of indicators. Some general descriptives here. I have for fiscal decentralization and political decentralization, what you have is a decentralization on the x-axis and bureaucratic politicization, and the size of the dots here is by levels of this aggregate indicator of environmental quality. One thing I want you to notice is that the pattern is not that clear. It's not that more decentralization clearly shows larger dots, not necessarily, or that more politicization also is linked to smaller dots or larger dots. So the pattern is not that clear. There's another also empirical piece of evidence of this information that's important here is that decentralization and bureaucratic politics reforms actually very slow moving. So I have a 20-year panel. Actually, changes here are very, very small. So it is very difficult to identify, let's say, in a fixed effects model, identify within variation. So what I try to do is try to separate the within and between variation. I use what's called the Mundell-like decomposition approach, or like within between random effects models. What I look is, I can look with this at the within component, basically saying, I want to see how year-to-year changes in this variable cause will have an effect or correlated with an outcome I want. And I also have a between component, which essentially works as comparing countries. That's what I try to do in the analysis. I also have, this is important, I don't have it here, I don't have it in the formula, is I have any interactions between my decentralization variables and the bureaucratic professionalization, and this is the key piece of the empirical setting. The results are quite robust to other forms of modeling the data, so I'm kind of okay with it. But the effects are not super clear, and this is what I want you. This is what I want you to tell me how convincing this might. These are just the direct effects of the different measures of decentralization on the different three main aggregate outcomes. Climate change, as I mentioned, was the more global outcome. Environmental ecosystems vitality is the more regional ecosystems level measure. So the attributability is less clear, and environmental health are the local environmental goods. So this is PM2.5, so it's like local air quality, this is drinking water, so it's a bundle of these local goods. Some key aspects of the direct effects is that the most important effect of decentralization happens at the between level. So between explained decentralization, fiscal decentralization has in general positive effects, or is correlated with higher environmental quality. With political decentralization is less clear, at least for ecosystems. It seems that political decentralization might be better overall across countries. And what we expect is that here bureaucratic professionalization is the inverse of bureaucratic politicization. So more, like higher levels here mean that the bureaucracy is more meritocratic. And this is more or less what I see on average. More meritocratic countries have better environmental outcomes. So what I want you to hear opinions on is the moderation story. So are countries that are more professional, that are more politicized, that whose states are more politicized, they're better or worse when implementing decentralization? And this is more or less the story I want to tell. Is that environmental health here, these are the local environmental goods. The red line is for a high country, for countries with high levels of patronage. So on average, the environmental quality is, the effect of decentralization on environmental quality is negative, but the more decentralized, the less bad it is. The less bad the effects on environmental outcomes. So basically, what I want to see, or what I see here, is that countries that have more patronage, decentralization is not going to be as bad for local goods, for countries, and for these countries, in the case of more global environmental goods, decentralization is going to worsen the outcomes. So this is more like the pattern I want to see, is that the lower the decentralization, the patronage, the results are worse, but the slope is positive, as it were. And I also try to see that in different, like some of the subcomponents of the environmental performance indicators. It is not so clear. In some cases it is that at least the main differences are in levels, meaning like more patronage or more politicized states have lower outcomes, but the slope again of the effect is not so, it's positive for air quality, for instance, or is positive for, or is not, there's no clear relationship with, or it's positive, sorry, with sanitation and drinking water. So I have some patterns here, and there is not very clear. In some cases, it doesn't work as well. Just like, how far should I go? Should I explore the different patterns? Or what would be the piece of evidence that would tell you, hey, perhaps this makes sense? And like for an 8,000 word paper, what would be enough? And I think I will leave it there